entered this past week feeling cautiously optimistic. Stay with me. Not with regards to the state of our own country. That brought and continues to bring many other feelings. But with the actual possibility, after 470 days of war, that a ceasefire would start in Gaza and Israel, and some of our hostages would come home. I found myself anxious, full of both hope and fear. And after last Shabbat, going into the new week, we were all still waiting to hear the names of the 3 hostages who were going to be returned, which was delaying the process. I remember thinking, what if it all falls through? What if it all falls apart now? And I woke up on Sunday morning checking my phone incessantly to find out what was happening, what was going on. The moment that I saw the UN vans driving toward the border, I was transported back to the last hostage deal and ceasefire all the way back in November of 2023. That same excitement, the joy, the sense of relief. As I was refreshing the news over and over again, I began to tear up as the pictures and the headlines changed and they started to show the images of the hostages' family members finding out that their loved ones were once again in safe arms. My heart raced as the vans got closer and closer to the border, and I cried watching Romy Gonen, Emily Damari, and Daron Steinbrecher embrace their mothers to give them a hug for the first time in 471 days. As I sat there watching, the tears flowing down my face, I was also incredibly surprised by the onslaught of complex emotions that rapidly followed this sense of joy and relief. At first, I had muted happy tears because I was both in public and I was also with my small children, so I couldn't make too much of a scene. But then it shifted, and it wasn't only that feeling of joy and happy tears, but I felt myself like that well starting to come up, and if it weren't for the fact that I were with my children and also had been in public, I felt like I would have started sobbing and I might not have ever stopped. I began to think about Hirsch and Omer, of their mothers Rachel and Orna, of all the hostages who never made it back, of those who might come back in body bags, of the 91 who still remain in Gaza, and please God, it's shifting right now. I started to think of the tens of thousands of innocent Palestinian lives that were lost, the children, the women, the families, the hundreds of soldiers who are not coming home. It all started to become even more complicated as I began to see the images of the Palestinians returning to their homes, and what I like to say, it looked almost like a split sea of rubble, and that rubble used to be their homes. And then I started to see the posts from family members and friends, both here and in Israel, who were speaking about some of the Palestinian prisoners who were being released, who had murdered family members of theirs or friends of theirs years ago, and also posts of other people who were saying, look at this long list of Palestinians, innocent Palestinians who too are returning home to their families in this moment. It's overwhelming. It's a week that reminds us just how complicated it is to be human. Not that we need that reminder, we feel it all the time, but this week it was acute. And as Rachel Goldberg-Polin wrote, we humans are capable of juggling the elation of seeing families reunited, and we can feel crushed and broken for the families for whom the end is not as rosy. And then we can wonder what's for dinner. We can do all of this at the same time. And then she says, welcome to being human. I went back and forth about if I should teach and talk about this morning. It felt so pressing. This is how I've been feeling all week, since standing on the bima last week, thinking about what it was that we would talk about and how it would feel and the excitement. And then it dawned on me that this is the morning that we're actually, please God, supposed to have another 4 hostages who are coming home on their way back, hopefully now, their conversations, and then as I thought about it, I realized with my Shabbat practice, I have no idea what's happening. I don't know. I can't check my phone to know minute to minute where they are, if they're in the hands of the soldiers, if what's happening with the vans. But I still decided that this moment embodies so much of what it feels like to live through and in this reality right now. So much of the uncertainty and hope and fear, this moment of cautious optimism. I feel and I felt a need to embrace this moment because maybe the hostages have been released already, please God, and we will continue in a state of this cautious optimism. Or maybe our hearts will shatter again and we must collect ourselves painfully, but we'll do it, and return to a state of possibility and hope, having tasted what it can be and knowing that this can't and won't last forever. And it's from this fragile and vulnerable lens and complete emotional overload that we can begin to empathize with Moshe in this week's Parashat of Va'era. It's not really that difficult to imagine or even piece together from some of the things that we already know and have heard from the Torah, how what Moshe's emotional turmoil must have been like and what it felt like for him as he was forced to approach Pharaoh repeatedly and inflict plagues upon Pharaoh and the Egyptian people. Potentially fear, anxiety, a sense of being an imposter, the pain in knowing that he is causing both the Israelites and the Egyptians more suffering. In all of his glory, Moshe, like us, was human. He had to juggle all of his complex emotions, which we can only imagine were heightened by his complicated identity as both an Israelite and also an Israelite who was raised in Egyptian royalty. And through the burden of his emotions, he continued to return to the banks of the Nile to negotiate with Pharaoh. Maybe this was the time Pharaoh was going to let them go. That the nightmare of slavery and now the plagues and suffering of the Egyptian people would end. But unlike the way we often paraphrase this story where Moshe is demanding, Shalach et ami, let my people go, and then Pharaoh says, no, no, no. This is not actually what happens. It's not really how it goes. After some of the plagues, Pharaoh actually doesn't really react at all. In some of them, he just stays silent. He just kind of lets it happen and roll over. But then in others, and what we're going to see today and read today, he says yes, and then he changes his mind. Something that feels all too familiar. After the fourth plague of Arov, Pharaoh says to Moshe, he says, go and you can sacrifice to your God, you can worship your God. And he says, but you have to stay in this land. And they have a back and forth. Moshe says, no, but we can't stay here. We have to go at least 3 days into the wilderness to be able to worship our God. Where Pharaoh says, just go. I'm going to let you go. And if you go, please pray that this stops. I can't stand anymore the swarms of bugs, all of these plagues. Just make this one stop, and you can go. And as he's leaving, Moshe says to Pharaoh, he turns and he says, when I leave your presence, I will plead with Adonai that the swarms of insects or the Arov depart tomorrow from Pharaoh and from his people. And then he says, but let not Pharaoh again act deceitfully, not letting the people go to sacrifice to Adonai. He tells us this happened before. What he's talking about is, in his frustration, Moshe is reminding and referencing back to the fact that 2 plagues ago in the frogs, Pharaoh did the exact same thing. Pharaoh said, make it stop. We can't stand the frogs anymore. It's too much. And he said, pray that it stops, and if you stop that, I'll let you go. You can leave. And Moshe prays, the frogs stop, and in the moment that it stops and everything clears up, Pharaoh reneges on his promise, he changes his mind, and he refuses to let the people go. Living through the past 15 months, I know how Moshe could have been feeling and what he might have said to himself in this very moment, in that moment of the back and forth, and maybe it's happening, maybe it's not, the hope that we get filled with. Does it give us more hope? Does it give us more of a sense of caution? where do we sit? But maybe he would have said to himself, if only it all ended with the frogs. The Egyptian people could have been spared so much of the suffering. If only their leaders stepped away from their stubbornness. The relentless, over-the-top plagues that were put upon the people as collective punishment. I have to watch this over and over again. The continued suffering of the Israelites. How much suffering could have been spared? How many lives could have been saved? But maybe, he thought to himself, with the Arov, in this moment, in this fourth plague, this is going to be the breaking point. And so he kept going, and he kept hoping and staying in that place. And even though sadly, and even the rest of this parasha, we know that their freedom isn't going to come, the Exodus doesn't start until another 6 plagues, we still know that it's going to come, and redemption is on its way. Through it all, Moshe was on an emotional journey, one we know well, one in which we had to approach with a sense of cautious optimism, and one in which he too had to approach with this sense of cautious optimism. Sometimes it's incredible in which the ways that our similarities in our lives awaken an empathy within us, and that our lives allow us to see the Torah and to understand the Torah in new ways. And in the same sense and at the same time, the Torah comes to guide us and to anchor us and to remind us that, please God, relief is coming. And while much will change, the wandering and a new kind of hard work is about to begin. And it's once we have this relief, once we feel like our feet are back on the ground, not as much in that cautious place, but really when we get there in certain senses, I don't think we'll ever get there fully, but once we can leave that state of cautious optimism and really begin to live a new reality, there's one piece, one final teaching from this parasha that I want us to take with us. The Midrash in Shemot Rabbah pulls a lesson from Pharaoh continuously changing his mind and going back and forth. And it says, Kach derech harishaim. This is the way of the wicked. When they are in narrow straits, they scream. Shehen batzara hem tzoakim. When they're in trouble, when they're in those places, they'll scream out. Uve'et harvacha chozrin likil kulan. But once they get to that spaciousness, once they feel that relief and they feel secure, they go back to their corrupt ways. While none of us here are inflexible, wicked leaders, although unfortunately we feel like we're around that too much, there is still a very important message for each of us to take. After living through this period of fragile hope, as we finally begin to feel some sense of that relief, and even though it's cautious, the rabbis remind us that we may have this evil inclination within us to forget where we once were, where we've been in the past, where we are presently, and to sink back into the status quo. And I think that's the reason that we retell this story every day, twice a day, in the morning in our tefillah and in the evening. The reason why we read it yearly in our cycle of Torah reading today, and we continue throughout the next few weeks, and why we retell it around our Seder tables each and every year. It's because we can't forget that we were slaves in Egypt, and it's incumbent on us to use this memory to bring good into the world, not just to slip back into where we were before. Let us learn from Emily and Doron and Romy and their families who returned last week, and each of them, every single time they speak of their joy and their gratitude and their relief, they say, but we can't stop until every single one of those hostages are home. And they say, we feel the pain and the suffering of every single one of those families who will never see their loved ones again. Please, God, may we use this as a moment of compassion, not of a competition of over whose pain is more valuable or whose suffering more brutal, but of figuring out a way we can move forward together into the wilderness that awaits us. Shabbat Shalom.